Yeah, so we do have time to cover dual innervation. Now, this is the thing. In all those duos and pairs and partners we had earlier, sometimes they butt heads. Again, they're not opponents, but sometimes they do try to control something. They like to seize control of the situation compared to their partner or how they would deal with it. So the thing is that dual innervation is when you have innervation, but by both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, in general, most of the time, if an organ has both parasympathetic and sympathetic nerve fibers, the activity of one will actually be completely opposite the other. But again, this is another caveat. Even though that many organs and tissues are innervated by the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, not all of them are have dual innervation. So things like your erector pili. So, all right, let's ask the chat again. So, when you get goose pimples, goose bumps, chicken skin, is that typically sympathetic or parasympathetic? So think about it, like which is the more intense situation, which is the more relaxed situation, and when would you get this kind of like your hair standing on end? During a sympathetic response that's more intense, or something that's relaxing? Yeah, so that's going to be sympathetic, right? So it will be a sympathetic response. Now that's the interesting thing. In rector pili, they have sympathetic nervous fibers, but they don't have parasympathetic nervous fibers. So the sympathetic can cause it to the hair to stand up. But parasympathetic, there's no fibers, so it's not going to tell them to flatten. Okay, so then systemic blood vessels. This is where it gets tricky, so just go based on the slides. But things that, in general, sympathetic nervous system. So again, remember when you're dealing with doing exercise, and this is another reason why they say, hey, maybe it's not a good thing to eat too much before exercise, because what happens if you're exercising, you're activating your sympathetic nervous system. Well, you're going to shut down activity to your nervous system or your gastrointestinal tract and your digestive organs. Doesn't shut down completely, but does decrease the activity. So another thing is it's also going to decrease the blood flow to that area because it's trying to actually supply more blood to your skeletal muscles, your heart, your lungs, the things you're actually using to do the sympathetic response. And so again, the interesting thing is that the sympathetic nervous system, and this is a cool thing about the autonomic nervous system, it can kind of pick and choose and be selective. So what it's doing is like taking the blood that would be to your digestive organs down here and moving it to where you need it. So again, like your skeletal muscles. Now parasympathetic, conflicting information regarding the GI tract, and this is the thing. If there's conflicting information and I tell you like that, don't worry too much about conflicting information. So don't worry too much about this. But the thing is that, why do I say it? Martini says there is no parasympathetic nervous innervation of GI blood vessels, but I looked and researched online, and they're finding parasympathetic nervous system innervation of the blood vessels that supply your digestive organs. So Martini disagrees with more recent, or the Martini version of the book disagrees with the most recent research. So I won't test you on parasympathetic innervation of the GI tract blood vessels. Now, GI tract itself you should know, but blood vessels that lead to the GI tract, don't worry too much about that. And the parasympathetic nervous system, no effect on skeletal muscle blood vessels. So interesting that you have it in the sympathetic, but not the parasympathetic. So this is a little complex. Don't worry too much about this. This is especially if you're going to like medicine or I guess if you're in kinesiology, you might need to know this as well. Okay, sweat glands, sympathetic. So when you think again, sympathetic, classic example of sympathetic activity, exercise. Do you get sweatier or do you get drier when you exercise? Typically, exercise for long enough, you start sweating, right? So sympathetic activity triggers activities of your sweat glands. Again, you're moving, you're generating a lot of heat. You're also ramping up your metabolism, which also generates heat. So you have the heat from your skeletal muscles and your metabolism. You want all this water from your sweat to cool you off. That's why you have sweat gland activity with sympathetic nervous system activity. So the sympathetic nervous system stimulates sweating, but parasympathetic. So this is an interesting thing. Sweat glands are not dually innervated. So the parasympathetic isn't like turning off the faucet. It doesn't really, at least the last time I checked, it doesn't have nerve fibers leading to the sweat glands. So sweat glands are almost exclusively sympathetic.